think many of the things that we just heard resonate quite well from an organizational standpoint as well. And one of the things that I'm going to describe, I guess, is a perspective on innovation from a social perspective, but also from the perspective of individuals, of groups, teams, companies, and where a lot of the work is actually getting done. And the story I want to share with you is to look back in history to begin to be able to look forward and to tell you a story that started from a fairly islands of knowledge and moving to an environment of an abundance of knowledge. So this idea of cradle to cradle and going for abundance rather than trying to reduce the negativity, going for the positivity. I think we'll see this here too. We'll even see a little bit of architecture along the way. I hadn't thought of those connections till this afternoon. We're going to see some stuff around knowledge and information structures, computer architectures come into this. We heard earlier about the mainframes and the like. And I've only got 15 minutes between you and the drinks, so I'm going to have to be quick in going through this quick tour. One thing we're going to see in the future are things like this. This is a Creative Commons license, which is a way of sharing our knowledge with the world. A sharing that says, here it is, use it any way you can, but by the way, acknowledge where it came from. Attribution is one of the currencies in a sharing economy. It isn't simply stealing or borrowing, whatever, it's acknowledging, it's sharing, attributing, and then moving along and building on that. And so I offer this to you in that spirit as well. And I'm going to start with another model. We've heard a lot about models today. Academics know that models aren't reality. A good model leaves a lot of things out. But the reason we do that is to focus more attention on what is kept in. And so you see here a model of a company's research and development process, often called R&D. And the way I've drawn the model here, which is quite typical in many of our textbooks, is that of a funnel. Or you'll sometimes hear this described as a pipeline, or a portfolio. But the idea in all these cases is a company has a knowledge base that it uses to initiate new projects. So the little squares here you can think of as individual projects. Now in the beginning, when we're starting the process, we consider many possibilities, which is why in this imagery, the funnel, the intake is quite large. But we don't finish everything we start. We abandon things along the way as we learn, as we update, as we have to make resource allocation decisions. Decide what we're going to continue, what we're going to stop. So we start a lot more than we finish. And then the rest of that gets out through to the market. So from the laboratory to the marketplace, we journey through the R&D process. Now you may have noticed I've labeled this a closed system. And I've done this because in this model there's one way into the innovation process and one way out. So keep that property in mind. One example of this, Britton, Bardeen, and Shockley in 1948 with the discovery of the transistor, for which they would receive the 1956 Nobel Prize in Physics. Really a truly enormous technical achievement, of enormous practical value as well. And yet it would take the company that paid for this research, AT&T, the owner of Bell Laboratories, it would take them a decade before they would actually ship a product using this technology. So they paid for it. They got the discovery, they even got the patents, but it would take them a decade to use them. One of the very first companies to ship a product, years ahead of AT&T, came from bombed out post-war Japan, a little startup company called Sony, which even though they didn't invent the technology and had done none of the background research that led to the discovery, they were able to get to the market much faster because they found a way to use the technology in an application that was good enough for what they could use. So they started with virtually nothing as a small startup, and yet were able to leverage this technology quite successfully. So you already begin to see, even looking back then, some of the fault lines that emerged in the closed model. Here's where the architecture comes in. Over here is AT&T Bell Labs in New Jersey. Some of you may recognize Eero Saarinen's work at IBM's T.J. Watson Research Center in suburban New York for IBM. If you just look at these structures, I submit to you they look like fortresses of knowledge, built to keep things in, built to protect. They are separated a long way from everything else. In IBM's case, it's way up on a hill, and there's no other building for half a mile or more anywhere around it. And there's security all around. So when I talk about trying to keep this stuff in, I'm not kidding. The security is intense in some of these places. Why do I think that the model has changed from this closed model to things that are starting to enable those startups like Sony and others to get to the market well ahead of the people who often fund the basic research? There's a few things that go on. All of these I would describe as erosion factors that promote diffusion of knowledge. One of the biggest institutions that promote the diffusion of knowledge is where we are today, a university. We are in the business of discovering new knowledge, and once we discover it, we don't keep it to ourselves. We publish it, we teach our students, we have these wonderful technology transfer devices called graduate students that we train, don't pay very well, but they're whip smart, and then off they go, and they are the carriers often of these new things. Initially to other large companies, but often to new startup companies as well. So that's a big one. Another one would be the diffusion that comes from a highly mobile workforce. Fewer and fewer of us are going to work for one company throughout our lives. Most of us are going to work for many organizations going forward. And when we do this, we take our knowledge that we learned from one experience and we take it with us to the next. And no one pays the earlier company for all the training and knowledge and experience that you get. You carry that knowledge with you. And because we've decided that slavery is not a good social institution, this knowledge is imbued in us. We carry it with us. I'll skip a couple of these, but I don't want to skip the last one, our friends in the venture capital sector. Venture capital, a generation ago, when you saw those buildings from AT&T and IBM and the others, was really a cottage industry that really only emerged in the 1960s and into the early 1970s. Today it's an enormous economic force, but notice this. Venture capital doesn't pay for research. Venture capital only pays for development. No R, only D. So what we thought of as innovation, as research and development joined together, as a process of taking ideas from the laboratory to the market, begins to separate. We begin to see markets emerge, spurred by institutions like this, pulling research from many different places into startup companies backed by external capital, trying to grow and attack incumbent firms and new markets. And so indeed, the startup firms are often the agents of new technology, diffusion, new technology adoption, doing the experiments in the social sphere to find the business models that are actually going to be successful. I love the discussion we had earlier about the photovoltaic industry, where there's a lot of innovation on the business model now. And we've learned that people won't pay to install solar panels and then get the energy from the panels, but they will lease solar panels if somebody else pays to get them installed. And then whoever pays them becomes an energy utility that sells the energy to the homeowner. So the capital comes from the other source, not the homeowner. And the homeowner now not only gets renewable electricity, but they get a price that they can lock in for 15 years no matter what happens to the oil prices. Or if fracking becomes real or not, doesn't matter. I am locked in for the next 15 years thanks to my solar panels. That is a winning business model, and it only emerged from the experimentation process led by a lot of people being funded by venture capital. So there's a lot of experimentation in the laboratory for science and technology, but there's also a lot of experimentation out in the social sphere, trying to find sustainable ways to really create value from this, value in excess of what it costs you to deliver it. Some data on what I think is a story that's consistent with this shift from a more proprietary, a more vertically integrated, more closed approach to a more open approach. These are data from the US, sorry about that, but they're from the National Science Foundation on R&D spending, and I've organized them by the year in which the spending was being done. And I'll go back to the days of 1981, the days where the mainframes ruled the roost. It was the year that IBM introduced the personal computer, which along with the Apple II that came out a few years earlier really began to transform the computer landscape and bring computing to all of us. So in 1981, if you look and see where was the R&D spending taking place in that year, more than 70% of all the R&D spending in that year was being done in very large companies of more than 25,000 employees. So those big fortresses of knowledge I was showing you, that's what you're getting for this kind of spending. Meanwhile, in that same year, the small companies, and in the US, a small company by the National Science Foundation is less than 1,000. I know it's different here. My apologies again. But aggregating below 1,000 employees, all added together, less than 5% of the R&D spending in that year was done in a small company. Now zoom forward to 2008. The large companies haven't gone away. They're still just under 35% of all the R&D spending now. So they're still an important part of the system. But look at those small companies now. Those ones of less than 1,000 employees are nearly a quarter of all the R&D spending going on. And so this has fallen in relative shares by half. This has grown by a factor of nearly 6 in that generation. So it's a more distributed environment, a more level playing field. I would submit a more open innovation system that we're seeing. And don't take it only from me. Take it from some of the leading science-driven companies, companies who used to have business models dedicated to internal investment in deep laboratory science and then carrying those results into the marketplace. This is from Merck in the pharmaceutical industry, saying that we do about 1% of the world's biomedical research. Well, as soon as you put it that way, it becomes blindingly obvious that what about the other 99%? And indeed, as they consider it, they say we've got to connect to and take advantage of the other 99% of the research we're not paying for, that we're not doing ourselves. So this is a case where it's not just the message, it's also the messenger. Even they have figured this out. Or take it from Bill Joy, a Berkeley grad, a founder of Sun Microsystems, which, by the way, stands for Stanford University Network. So this is a technology that came out of a university. He was a Berkeley computer science PhD, founder of a startup company that became a very big company. And what is he doing today? He is a venture capital partner at Kleiner Perkins. So the arc of his own career is consistent with the story I'm telling. And Bill Joy's message to us is, I don't care who you are. I don't care how big you are. I don't care how long you've been doing it. I don't care how smart your organization is. Not all the smart people work for you. Or alternatively, most of the smart people work somewhere else. So if you start with that premise, you think about building innovation structures and processes differently than you do when you're building these fortresses of knowledge. As it happens, sometimes the representations that do the best job of showing this are done by others. So the folks in the front here can actually see this was stolen with pride by a guy in Sweden named Bengt Jarahult who works for SCA. And Bengt has given me permission to steal it back and share it with you. So in his translation of my story, he says this innovation process you start with in the closed world aims your R&D at your current market and takes little or no account of these other possibilities. And the first thing you do in open innovation is you drill holes in that funnel. And with the holy funnel, you have different pathways for ideas and technologies to go to not just the current market, but to other markets as well. So it's a much more distributed, much more open process with many pathways to explore. Some of them from the outside coming into your organization. That would be the first half of the model. The other half going from the inside, remember we don't finish everything that we started inside, so the unfinished work inside might be useful outside for somebody else to use instead. That's the inside-out half. Those are the two halves of this model. More recently, some colleagues at Imperial College in London have proposed an interesting taxonomy of both inbound and outbound. Inbound meaning the outside in, outbound meaning inside out. And then looking at both pecuniary-based and non-pecuniary-based motivations for sharing knowledge. So you can be selling or acquiring things when you're getting paid money, depending whether you're going out or bringing in. And you also have people on the non-pecuniary side, also engaged in sharing knowledge, but not primarily for monetary reasons. And those people are either sourcing or revealing the knowledge that they share. So all of these need to become part of the innovation repertoire of an organization that's trying to follow Bill Joy's admonition that, hey, not all the smart people work for you. You need to engage and access the others. How am I doing on time? Time to get to the end. Thank you. I will skip my examples of Philips. I'm sure many of you know the Eindhoven high-tech campus there, and you may even know the story of how it used to be a highly secure environment, and they have since torn down all the security fencing along the way. And what started out as an internal research laboratory of 1,500 Philips researchers is today a community of more than 7,000 people based here, and Philips, as I understand it, no longer even owns the real estate. They've even sold that off. So what was a 1,500 person internal structure is today a much more diverse community of many parts. I'll skip all that. So what does this mean for innovation, for companies? This is my last slide, and it means that we have to rethink what we mean when we talk about innovation and R&D and the role of companies in doing this work. It means that, yes, we still care about knowledge discovery. That remains very important. I would observe that a lot of that work is now shifting from industry to the university. And so here in the 40th anniversary of celebrating Hasselt and looking forward to the future, I would say that the role of the university in the basic research that's going to fuel the breakthroughs of the future is even more fundamental and important today in this model than it was in the more traditional model of a generation ago. I think that's going to continue. I don't see many companies making big investments to get back into deep basic science in their own laboratories. But for the companies that are trying to commercialize knowledge from many different places, they're not simply going to have to discover, they're also going to have to connect. And this is a very interesting one. They're going to have to integrate both internal and externally acquired or sourced or shared ideas and put them together to create systems and solutions that solve real problems. And that integration task is something I think universities are going to need to get much better at between now and 2053. Today at Berkeley, you don't get a PhD for doing an excellent job of combining other people's stuff together. You get a PhD for doing something that fundamentally advances the field that you're studying. So our graduates all too often come out very, very deep, but pretty narrow. And if we take this system integration or integration imperative seriously, we're going to need programs at universities that train people to be T-shaped, where yes, they do have a deep capability in one area, but they have enough depth that they can intelligently and usefully connect and leverage and integrate other people's knowledge as well. And the last thing I'll say is that this idea of business models that we heard in the last couple of presentations as well, I think suggests that this is too important to leave to the suits. Those of us who work in technology, who work in R&D, who work in the basic science, who are good at hypothesis development and hypothesis testing and framing research experiments, need to bring those disciplines to the domain of business models as well. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you very much.